Hey guys, before we get into the show today, I wanted to let you in on a new project that Kevin and I have been working on. We're calling it the Vegan's Almanac. This is going to be a 5-minute daily show that highlights some good news in the world of veganism. And it will end with a moment of beauty, a prayer, a poem, meditation, a hymn, something that will inspire you each day with the hope of God's kingdom of nonviolence. I know you're going to love making the Vegan's Almanac a beautiful part of your daily practice. We've been having so much fun putting it together. So stay tuned because the Vegan's Almanac is coming your way, and it will be available wherever you get your podcasts. And now, on with the show. The priesthood went out of their way to, he uses the word, eviscerate every trace of this notion that God is actually eating this food, right?
Right.
So that would be revelation to the ancient Near Eastern person.
Right.
Oh, God doesn't need you to feed him.
Right.
Okay. That's revelation to the ancient person. But it seems like they're still compelled
To go through this ritual.
to offer the food to
Right.
God for God's consumption, even though they're like, well, it's just metaphorical. It's just a metaphorical consumption of this food. We still believe that it's attracting God. It's how I see this is like there's this push and pull. There's this tension between revelation and culture.
Right.
Well, we can't quite completely stop doing that, but we are starting to understand something new here.
Hey everyone, this is Vegan Theology, episode 33 with Kevin and Sarah Hale.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a wonderful day, enjoying at least a moment of peace and knowing that God is good. So here we go. We are at chapter 2 of Andrew Remington Rillera's book, Lamb of the Free, Recovering the Varied Sacrificial Understandings of Jesus' Death. This chapter is Understanding Old Testament Sacrifices, Part 2. Part 2 of 4, I might add. And this chapter is all about the non-atoning sacrifices. Just to kind of give a little roadmap where we've been, where we are, where we're going. 2 episodes ago, we spent time learning a little bit about the ancient Near Eastern culture, their religion, their animal sacrifice practices. Last episode, we covered chapter 1 of this book, and that was all about what Old Testament sacrifice is not. And if you recall, Old Testament sacrifice is not substitutionary. It's not about the death of the animal. And it's not about the suffering of the animal. And then, as I mentioned, this week is all about the sacrifices that were non-atoning. And then there's 2 more chapters explaining Old Testament animal sacrifice, chapter 3, chapter 4. And then once we have all of that under our belt, and we've done all that hard work of learning what he's teaching us, then we can finally approach Jesus and the death of Jesus with new eyes. And by that time, hopefully we'll be equipped by these first 4 chapters to see the death of Jesus in a new and deeper way. And then we have a conclusion chapter where Rillera will make his closing arguments. So I know that this is not easy necessarily, but I think the payoff is going to be worth the journey.
Yeah.
I wanted to start today by looking at how Rillera is going to use the word atonement. If you recall in our last episode, we traced the etymology of this word. It was first a phrase that John Wycliffe used when translating the New Testament to translate the Greek word katalasso, which means reconciliation. He used the phrase at one-ment. And then several hundred years later, Tyndale took this phrase and pushed it together into the word atonement, which is fine. And then we talked about how he then took this word atonement and he used that word in the Old Testament to translate the Hebrew word kippur or kippur.
Which means to clean, to cleanse, to decontaminate.
To purify.
Right.
Exactly. And the point was, that was an unfortunate choice. Reconciliation, to make at one with God, is a different concept than to decontaminate. So I was a little surprised when I read in the introduction of this book, Rillera writes, when I use atonement, atone, atoning, and so on, I am restricting this word group's meaning to the Levitical concept of kippur. And this study aims to show how differentiating between atoning and non-atoning sacrifice is crucial to understanding the sacrificial imagery applied to Jesus by various New Testament authors.
Yeah, it seems confusing.
I was so confused.
Yeah.
So you just got done telling us that the word atonement was a poor choice by the translator for the word kippur. But then you turn around and say, I'm going to be using the word atonement for the Hebrew word kippur. It took me a few days of wrestling with this, and he doesn't really offer any explanation for his choice. And the only logical explanation that my mind has been able to come up with, which I guess the more I sit with it, it does kind of make sense. He's thinking something along the lines of, okay, this is the way people use the word atonement. When people think of atonement, they think of the sense that Kippur is talking about. This is the common parlance. In fact, even English-speaking Jews use atonement as their English word for Kippur. So if you think about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is a big holiday on the Jewish calendar, they use the word atonement for Kippur.
Yeah, I also wonder, though, if we have concepts where people do that. There's like a known word, and we just go with that word, even though it's not the right word. And even in America, where we live in Montana. We're 2 hours from Yellowstone National Park, and there are these things roaming around everywhere called bison, but many people call them buffalo.
Yeah.
And so
Scientific taxonomy would say there are no buffalo in North America. The buffalo live in Asia and Africa, and what we have here in North America is technically bison, like you said.
Yeah.
But at some point, when enough people use the wrong word for long enough,
right.
do you just say, okay, that's the right word now?
Right.
So
Well, I
yeah.
remember we had a teacher. She corrected so many misspellings in papers that she started to misspell words.
Yeah, I suppose it's an evolving art, this thing called language. All right. So first of all, the concept non-atoning sacrifice. It's hard now to remember, what did I think? How did I understand sacrifice before we started reading about sacrifice?
Right.
And so I asked myself the question, would I have even known that there was such a thing as a sacrifice that is non-atoning?
Right. What's the point of a sacrifice if it's non-atoning? Right? Because I think in our minds as Christians growing up in the church, a sacrifice would be to atone for something. And if we're going to kill an animal and spill its blood and it's not atoning, that seems strange.
Yeah, so
It seems like a waste.
we're going to figure out what was going on.
Yeah.
Rillera himself says, it is all too common to think that there is only one purpose for Levitical sacrifice, namely to atone. However, not all sacrifices have an atoning function. Without getting into the history of religions, the origins of sacrifice in general, or ancient Israelite sacrifice in particular, it suffices for our purposes to note that there are two main categories for sacrifice. Okay? This is broadly speaking, he's putting all sacrifice into two main categories. These are the categories of gift offering display and pollution removal. So in terms that I have been using thus far in the Torah, these are the non-atoning well-being sacrifices and the atoning sacrifices, respectively. Keeping the categories broadly simplified in this way will help focus our attention when we get to the New Testament, since we will be able to distinguish between the atoning and the non-atoning sacrifices with ease. We got to do the work now to be able to understand and distinguish, so that when we finally get to the New Testament, we want to see what exactly is going on with the death of Jesus. Hopefully, things will be a lot more clear. In this chapter, Rillera has basically 7 arguments that we're going to be breaking down today. So let's go through those first so we kind of know what we're going to learn in this chapter. Number 1, not all sacrifices have an atoning function. There are non-atoning sacrifices that have separate rationales and functions. Number 2, the purpose of the regular burnt offerings is divine attraction or invitation. Number 3, the purpose of the well-being offerings is sacred feasting between God and people. Number 4, the Passover is neither about atonement nor substitutionary death. Rather, it is a non-atoning well-being sacrifice commemorating God's past act of deliverance. More specifically, it is most like the Thanksgiving well-being sacrifice. Number 5, the covenant inauguration and the covenant renewal ceremonies only use non-atoning sacrifices. Number 6, the blood sprinkling on the people in Exodus 24 is neither about atonement nor about substitutionary death. Rather, it is a way to signify and ratify the bond between two covenantal parties, God and Israel here. And finally, number 7, whenever blood is placed on people, it is never blood from the atoning sacrifice. The use of non-atoning sacrificial blood on people is to ritually mark specific metaphysical transitions.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting.
Rillera writes, moreover, the assumption that sacrifice always has an atoning function is not only inaccurate, but this misconception has also prevented New Testament scholars from noticing one of the most obvious and significant observations when it comes to comprehending the sacrificial understandings of Jesus. The earliest New Testament texts associate Jesus with the non-atoning sacrifices. These non-atoning sacrifices are also the most prevalent ones linked to Jesus' death across the New Testament. These non-atoning sacrifices are a covenant inaugurating sacrifice and the Passover. I will discuss these further below, but for now, we are just noting that both are categorized as types of the non-atoning well-being sacrifices.
Conveniently, it is straightforward to recognize if a sacrifice is atoning or non-atoning. If the laity eat from it, then it cannot be an atoning sacrifice. This is how we know, for example, that the Passover is a type of communal well-being sacrifice, since it is eaten by the laity. This is why these sacrifices are sometimes translated as fellowship or communion offerings, since these are a way for the worshiper to commune or fellowship with God at the sanctuary. I will discuss the purpose and function of atonement in chapter 4. But what is crucial for now is that if a sacrifice has an atoning function, then the laity never eat from it. And if the atoning sacrifice is atoning for the priest himself or priests as a group, then the priest is not permitted to eat from it either. As Jacob Milgram comments, priests are not to benefit from their own offenses. After the appropriate parts are burned on the altar and the appropriate blood ritual manipulations are made, then the carcass must be burned outside the camp, not on the altar. Basically, the sinner, priest or lay, cannot receive a tangible benefit, i.e. the meat, from a sacrifice whose purpose is to purge the sanctuary from their own sin contamination.
I like how there's this convenient cipher. If we're looking at a particular sacrifice, we can know very easily if it's atoning sacrifice or non-atoning sacrifice. The difference being, if it is an atoning sacrifice, nobody gets to eat the meat, or at least the person offering. The person offering the atoning sacrifice for their sin does not get to partake of the meat. Whereas if it's a sacrifice where the people are eating and feasting, that is a non-atoning, joyful celebration, a feast, basically.
A non-atoning sacrifice would be more like feasting, and a atoning sacrifice would be more like fasting.
Yeah, which again, going back to Yom Kippur, that is a time of complete fasting as atonement is sought from God. Here he wraps up this first section of the chapter. Another way to look at this is if there is a sacrificial feast, then we can be sure atonement is not taking place with those sacrifices. Whenever atonement is happening for someone, they are not feasting on the atoning sacrifice, insofar as nobody is permitted to eat from an atoning sacrifice that is offered for them, priest or lay. It is not feasting, but rather a sort of fasting in the sense of not consuming the sacrifice that is connected with atoning sacrifices. As we will see, these sacrificial feasts usually celebrate and commemorate a past act of divine deliverance. They are joyous feasts that have nothing to do with atonement. So there's sacrifices that are basically just a big party, a way of saying, thank you, God.
Right.
Thank you, God, for what you've done.
Commemorating what God has already done, deliverance, that kind of thing.
The first type of non-atoning sacrifice that we're going to look at specifically is the regular burnt offerings. There were regular, prescribed, twice daily burnt offerings, and these are called the tamid. You can read them in the text, Exodus 29 and Numbers 28. In these twice daily, just regular scheduled, regularly prescribed burnt offerings, the entire animal, except for his or her hide, which goes to the officiating priest, is burned up on the altar in the courtyard of the dwelling place. The purpose of these regular burnt offerings is to provide a pleasing aroma to God, to attract God's presence. Now, in Exodus 20, right after the Israelites were given the 10 Commandments, God says that he wants them to do these regular burnt offerings and also the well-being offerings. When he talks about the regular burnt offerings, he says, I will come to you and bless you. So the burnt offering is to elicit God's presence. The Hebrew word for this burnt offering is olah, which means that which ascends. The pleasing aroma ascends to heaven and thereby attracts God to the altar so he can, quote, meet with the Israelites there. That's Exodus 29. So when we see Solomon's temple inauguration, then the purpose of these regular burnt offerings could be best understood as the continuance of this divine presence. So they were offering these sacrifices twice a day just to make sure God's presence remained in the temple.
But why does burning an animal or grain produce a pleasing aroma that attracts God's presence? This is fairly straightforward once we realize that the ubiquitous rationale for ancient Mesopotamian and Greek sacrifice is that this provided foods for the gods. Although the Torah and the Old Testament as a whole rejects the notion that God literally eats the sacrifices, example Psalm 50, 12, and 13, nevertheless, the ancient notion of sacrifice as food is the controlling metaphor in the Torah. You can check out Leviticus 3:11 and 16, Leviticus 21, 6 and 8, Leviticus 17, Leviticus 21 to 22. Many of these are in close proximity to the idea that these sacrifices produce a pleasing aroma for God. Put baldly, the idea is that God senses the pleasing smell of the barbecue cookout, and like those classic cartoon portrayals, follows the smoke sent to its source.
When I read that paragraph for the first time, why does this attract God's presence? Well, he says the fairly straightforward answer is that this was the ubiquitous practice for all of ancient Mesopotamia and Greece, was to provide food for the gods.
Right. Which is what we mentioned 2 episodes ago, right?
Yes. But the fact that he is saying this is confirmation that what we're looking at here is a lot of culture.
Right.
This is just the way the ancient person understood their role in having a relationship with God. Having a successful relationship with God means we daily provide food for the gods. And then he says, although the Torah as a whole rejects the notion that God literally eats the sacrifices, nevertheless, the ancient notion of sacrifice as food is the controlling metaphor in the Torah.
Right. Reading this section and then the next section about the Passover, I just kept thinking, many people make this comparison, the Old Testament God versus the New Testament God. And Jesus obviously God came to man as a human, and he was very relatable as a human, versus this Old Testament God that maybe isn't as relatable, but the way he's written about in these passages, he seems like not a very personal God. right? And I think that's the problem that many people have between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's the description of God. And yet, as far as we understand, God's character is the same, Old Testament, New Testament. Jesus' character is the same as God, Old Testament, God's character. It's just interesting reading observations about God, like, hey, let's burn this and we'll draw God in, we'll invite God in to our camp and protect us. And then we have to do these other sacrifices to make sure he doesn't leave, right? These decontamination sacrifices, these atoning sacrifices, so we don't lose him in our presence. It just seems that God is an entity and not a person.
Yeah. It's a much different flavor than what Jesus reveals about who God is and how God relates to us. And I feel like we say this, at least we said it last episode and probably the episode before that on this subject. Again, this reminder, this amazing, humbling reminder that God is willing to enter into our context, our particular understanding, our culture. He's willing to enter into that, even if it's kind of messed up.
Right.
And he's willing to bless, and he's willing to work with, and he's willing to work through.
Right.
And every time I think about this, my next thought is God might even use us.
Right.
In spite of all of our flaws and our weaknesses, God might even use us.
I think we've seen it. We've said it. God does reform the culture. God takes these people, these ancient Near Eastern people, and transforms them out of that ancient Near Eastern culture. Some would say there's evidence of child sacrifice in ancient Israel. And that's something that was an abomination to God. And so you can see God reforming these things. There are other examples.
I love this passage of the chapter, and he has an extensive footnote about how the Old Testament, the priesthood, went out of their way to, he uses the word, eviscerate every trace of this notion that God is actually eating this food, right?
Right.
So that would be revelation to the ancient Near Eastern person.
Right.
Oh, God doesn't need you to feed him.
Right.
Okay. That's revelation to the ancient person. But seems like they're still compelled
to go through this ritual,
to offer the food to God for God's consumption, even though they're like, well, it's just metaphorical. It's just a metaphorical consumption of this food. We still believe that it's attracting God. It's how I see this is like there's this push and pull. There's this tension between revelation and culture.
Right.
Well, we can't quite completely stop doing that, but we are starting to understand something new here.
But that is the perpetual problem, even today in America, culture versus God.
I loved what you said earlier, that God is constantly reforming and redeeming culture. What I think about when you say that is even bringing a more vegan perspective,
Right.
a better perspective of our role, our task as human species on this planet. That could be one of the ways that God is reforming our culture. May it be, Lord
Amen.
Jesus. At its most basic level, then, Israelite sacrifice is about preparing sacred food for God to consume metaphorically, and sometimes for worshipers, priests, and lay to consume literally with God. The burnt offerings are solely for God to consume, but the well-being sacrifices discussed in the next section are consumed by God, the officiating priest, and the offerer. Risking oversimplification, the dwelling place is a divine residence outfitted with a sacred kitchen and a dining space as well as takeout restaurant for laity. Sometimes God is the only one being served a meal in the case of these burnt offerings.
Right.
And sometimes the lay Israelites, the priests, and God are all dining together, which would be the well-being offerings.
Keeping with a residence restaurant image, atonement is what is needed for this holy residence restaurant to maintain its grade A health score. The place itself, the dwelling place, its butchers, cooks, and servers, the priests, and its customers, the people, all need to be in a state of purity for the sacred meals to happen. Atonement rituals decontaminate the dwelling place, and the ritual purity regulations ensure that the human beings, both priest and lay, are fit to access the sacred space and foods.
He's talking about the role of the atoning sacrifices right here, which is to make sure that nothing is contaminated. So the atoning sacrifices keep the place clean so God can be there, but these burnt offerings are what attracts him to be there and stay there.
If God is omniscient, this is what I think is so strange. To me, this is, again, this points to the artifact of the ancient Near East. If God is omniscient, he doesn't need the smell of a barbecue to draw him in.
Exactly.
Right. He can see and he can sense
So yeah, he
people's
doesn't
obedience.
he doesn't need to be fed by us.
Right.
Got rid of that, hopefully, or we're getting rid of that in the case of the Old Testament Israelites. But he also, what you're saying, he doesn't need to smell something yummy to be, oh, I want to be with you.
Right. More and more, the more I read, it just seems like there are these cultural artifacts from the ancient Near East that are still playing themselves out.
Yeah. We have reached the next section, and this is where we learn about well-being offerings. So as you recall, with those regular twice daily burnt offerings, God was the only one consuming, metaphorically. Well, with these well-being sacrifices, and there's two Hebrew words for these well-being sacrifice, selamim or ziba. He says the fact that there are these two different terms would point to the fact that they originated in separate sources or ancient Israelite schools. But he says they are unambiguously synonymous, and neither is ever confused with an atoning sacrifice. So wherever in the Hebrew we see the word selamim or ziba, it is referring to these well-being sacrifices. The thing that differentiates these from the burnt offerings, is that God consumes them with the people consuming them. The meat is consumed together in a joyous feast.
As Gary A. Anderson explains, the role of human consumption constitutes the primary level of meaning for this sacrifice and helps to explain why the olah and the selamim are routinely paired in biblical and Ugaritic ritual. The olah was the sacrifice that constituted the basic nourishment for the deity, while the selamim in turn nourished the people.
He says the burnt offering always precedes the well-being sacrifice, but they do go together. One attracts God, and then the second one is let's feast together.
Right.
These are the only sacrifices from which the laity eat. The food is split 3 ways between God, the priests, and the offerers. He says sacred eating is the most basic rationale for Israelite sacrifice. Think about that.
I know.
Sacred eating, going back to sanctifying the killing and eating of animals.
Right.
Sacred eating is the most basic rationale for Israelite sacrifice. The core logic of Old Testament sacrifice is sacred eating, either God alone or God and humans feasting together. He mentions that the well-being offerings need to be accompanied by a grain offering and a drink offering, thus creating a full meal.
Right. That's funny. It's like a happy meal.
This all reinforces the fact that sacrifice is fundamentally about sacred meals. Again, God's eating and drinking is always considered metaphorical and symbolic in all the biblical texts. Still, the power of the symbolic framework is that the worshipers who themselves are eating and drinking are sharing in a sacred meal with God, even if God's consumption of the meal is qualitatively different from literal eating and drinking. Clearly, these feasts have nothing to do with sin and nothing to do with atonement for sin.
Rillera also says, it is also worth recalling the discussion on Leviticus 17 in chapter 1, where we learned that eating meat from the flock or herd, apart from the context of sacrificial worship, is conceptualized as murder. That's Leviticus 17:3-6. This helps us see how the main practical function of the well-being offering is to provide meat for the table in the context of sacrifice at the dwelling place. Although the blood for the well-being sacrifices has no atoning function, their blood rituals are vital since they serve to transfigure the death of the animal into not a killing, per the logic of Leviticus 17. Discussed in chapter 1.
So interesting he's bringing that up again.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I never have heard a preacher preach on that.
Right, me neither.
That
It's interesting.
God said if you don't kill an animal in this way, that it is murder.
Right.
These well-being offerings are at their core offerings of thankfulness, and they are joyous sacrifice par excellence. That's according to Milgram. This brings us back to the non-atoning function of the burnt offerings and how it logically relates to the non-atoning function of the well-being offerings, i.e. that the ola was utilized for the purpose of invoking the deity preparatory to joining with God in a fellowship of sacrifice, the well-being offering, which was the context for petition and thanksgiving and for the expression of other religious attitudes of this character. Importantly, while the burnt offering can be offered by itself and the divine attraction function can relate to the worshiper's desire to petition God, now that God is there and thus attentive, the well-being sacrifice is almost always a retrospective offering to rejoice and thank God for some antecedent act of deliverance and or general well-being. So now that we have just a basic understanding of what the regular scheduled burnt offerings were and the well-being sacrifices were, it does make more sense now that these are not about sin. They're not about atoning for sin.
Right.
Now, Rillera wants us to look very closely. Now we're going to focus in on two specific types of well-being sacrifices because these two sacrifices are going to inform what's going on with the death of Jesus. And they are the Passover and the covenant inauguration / covenant renewal ceremonies. And so next we're going to look at the Passover specifically.
Nice.
The Passover is a required annual sacrificial feast for all Israel to celebrate their deliverance from Egypt. Here I will discuss what the Passover is and is not, removing prevalent misconceptions. As I will show, the Passover is best categorized as a Thanksgiving well-being sacrifice. He spends some significant time explaining that the first Passover, as in the 10th plague,
Right.
when the people were wanting to be delivered out of Egypt, that first Passover was not a sacrifice. We should not understand that event as a sacrificial event. It was something unique. So what he's mostly talking about in this section is the subsequent required annual
Celebrations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, again, the well-being sacrifices are always remembering, commemorating all that God has done.
Right.
And of course, the deliverance out of Egypt is a pretty big deal
Right.
that they're going to want to remember every year and celebrate and thank God for.
Whereas the Thanksgiving offering is for celebrating a particular prior act of divine deliverance. Thus, the Passover and the Thanksgiving offering also share the same motivation. Thanksgiving for deliverance, both national and individual. Again, Passover has nothing to do with atonement. This word is never used in either the initial ritual or in the subsequent explanations of it. This is unsurprising now given what has been laid out so far. Yet Christian scholars, in particular, seem especially predisposed to conflate sacrificial categories here. Since the laity eat from it, and since it is more specifically aligned with the non-atoning Thanksgiving well-being sacrifice, then it cannot have an atoning function. If it had an atoning function, then the people would be prohibited from eating from it. The Passover is a distinct Thanksgiving well-being sacrifice, thanking God for Israel's liberation from Egypt.
If there's eating involved, not about sin,
Right.
not about atonement. If there's eating involved, it's just a celebration, worshiping God and thanking God.
Yep.
Notably, and to anticipate chapter 5, just like the first Passover was a proleptic celebration for what was immediately about to happen, so too is the first Lord's Supper. Jesus not only tethers the meaning of his death with the Passover feast in general, with the timing of his death, and with the unleavened bread and wine, but that final meal itself was similarly explained as a proleptic celebration for what was immediately about to take place. All subsequent celebration feasts take on a memorial function, and the well-being offerings are the only kind of sacrifices said to have a memorial function in the Torah. This memorial function, per Numbers 10, is why, quote, all joyous celebrations that would have been marked by the well-being offering, the joyous sacrifices par excellence, since they commemorate acts of deliverance, both national and individual. So here he's starting to give us a little spoiler alert or something.
Right.
He's starting to say in the Last Supper, Jesus uses Passover history, Passover tradition, Passover understanding, try to explain what is about to take place.
We've run into the word proleptic before, and it means the representation of a thing as existing before it actually does or did so. Kind of foreshadowing, maybe.
Yeah, that Passover in Egypt was to show them that they're about to be protected as they leave Egypt. And the Passover, the night before Jesus dies, is to show what's about to happen. Something new is about to take place. Rillera moves into explaining for sure that we all are very clear that the Passover is not a substitutionary death. Some of the common, mostly Christian misunderstandings of Passover have already been indirectly corrected in the foregoing observations, but it is worth connecting the dots more explicitly here to address the most pressing misunderstandings for our purposes. The interpretation that the lamb dies in place of the firstborn of Israel, and its substitutionary death is indicated by the blood on the doorpost and lintel. This reading is, as Gilders notes, heavily dependent on the Western Christian doctrine of substitutionary atonement. But this reading is already hamstrung by the fact that the Passover, along with all other well-being sacrifices, was not about atonement, but what else might be going on besides celebrating divine deliverance, especially as Exodus 12 describes the first Passover. He enlightens us here. The blood on the doorposts, that blood functions as a signal for God to see it, so restrain the destroyer from smiting the house.
Right.
So this blood is a sign.
This passage, the way it's written, even in the text itself, he says it's a sign. The blood signals the presence of Israelites in the house. The blood is only said to serve as a tangible sign of remembrance, because at first Yahweh will see the blood and will remember the Israelites. And of course, again, that description, I struggle with God's omniscience when I read this. I know it's their understanding, and they didn't have Christ at that time. The ancient Israelites, they didn't have Christ, so they didn't know God in a very personal way, I guess. And maybe it's not a fair criticism that I'm making. However, the way it's written, it's a strange description of God if he's a very personal and loving God, and has all the classical attributes.
I love that you said, such a true and great reminder. These people didn't have Christ. So it's unfair for us to look back thousands of years on these ancient people and be like, the God that you have conceptualized sounds horrible.
Right.
And the way you worship is horrible. It's not fair for us, given what we know, what has been revealed to us, to be too hard on them.
Right.
But it is hard
Right.
to read. So Rillera gives a lot of evidence and a lot of proof that the lamb's blood on the doorframe is not to be seen as substituting for the firstborn child in the house. It's not like God said, if you kill a lamb and put the lamb's blood on the doorframe, that substitutes for the life of your child. It should be seen faithfully in looking at the text. It should be seen as a sign to God to protect this house from the destroyer. The blood acts as a protector of the people against the destroyer who's coming through.
Right.
And the fact that it's applied with hyssop, he mentions, also shows that it's used to ward off evil. He says, in fact, after setting forth all this information, then along with the previous observations about why the first Passover is not a sacrifice, there's no priesthood, there's no altar, there's no boiling of the meat, the presence of hyssop only at the first Passover is yet another way the text indexes that the first Passover is not a sacrifice. The absence of hyssop at all subsequent Passovers, therefore, makes sense if hyssop is only used in non-sacrificial rituals whose blood/animal components are not offered up to God on the altar. Therefore, the Passover does not have an atoning function, but the first Passover is depicted as having a protective Pesach apotropaic function. That word Pesach, you may know, is the Hebrew word that we've translated as Passover. He does say that word is better translated as protect or protection. So again, this idea that the blood is going to protect you from the death. Therefore, the Passover does not have an atoning function, but the first Passover is depicted as having a protective function, anchored as it is in the standard non-sacrificial ritual ingredients and procedures for warding off a threat, applying blood on a house with hyssop branches. All subsequent Passovers function as sacrificial commemorations of this event, celebrated by feasting on a unique type of non-atoning Thanksgiving well-being offering. Rillera wants us to learn a little bit about the covenant inauguration and the covenant renewal ceremonies. These are a specific type of the well-being sacrifices. Whenever there is a covenant being inaugurated or a covenant that's being renewed, and there's many examples, the covenant that's being inaugurated in this context in the Old Testament is at Sinai when we get the Mosaic covenant. And this is definitely a time of celebration, and it cannot have an atoning function. In particular, these are celebrating the ratification of the so-called Mosaic or Sinaitic covenant. It is this particularity that accounts for a peculiar blood ritual that is unique to Exodus 24. In addition to the altar, blood is also sprinkled upon the people. That's going to be part of the focus of this section, these specific well-being sacrifices where blood is actually applied to the people present. And what does that actually mean? He explains that in these contexts of inaugurating a covenant, the reason the blood is sprinkled on the people is actually just a visible memorial function. Dashing the blood on people happens just in covenant inauguration ceremonies. He explains the significance of the blood dashing ritual is that it serves a communicative function of remembrance precisely because of its visibility for the people to see. It's just a very stark a visual aid, I guess. We are having blood sprinkled on us. That is very powerful.
I wonder if it's like Ash Wednesday when get the ashes.
But he explains more. What purpose does dashing the blood on the people serve? The throwing of half of the blood of the offerings against the altar. The altar actually represents God. The altar is the presence of God. So by starting these celebrations with throwing half of the blood against the altar, which represents the Lord, and half on the people, or that which represented them, signifies a joining together of the two contracting parties and symbolize the execution of the deed of covenant between them. That is, the application of blood to both the altar and the people indicates a bond between the covenant parties. And he says this is a common view among Old Testament scholars. This interpretation is supported by two further observations. The first is noting how the two blood manipulations bookend the covenant inauguration ceremony. Moses first dashes the altar with the blood, and then he reads the book of the covenant, which the people affirm to obey. And after this affirmation, then he dashes the people with the same blood. These two blood manipulations frame the covenant-making ceremony and thus mark the bounds of a time in which Yahweh's words are offered to the people in a concrete written form, and the people express their acceptance of Yahweh as suzerain. They're not getting covered in blood as some kind of atoning ritual. They're getting sprinkled with blood as a reminder that they are parties to this contract, this covenant. The blood is on the altar. God is in this covenant. The blood is on us. We are a part of this covenant. His next subheading continues to prove what's going on with this application of blood. The heading is Sacrificial Blood Application to People Elsewhere, the metaphysical transition function. So there's two other situations in the Old Testament where blood is applied to people. One is at the ordination of Aaron and his sons as priests. And the second one is part of the post-healing ritual purification process for the person recovered from scale disease. So in both of those situations, the person getting blood applied to them, they are undergoing a metaphysical transition. And that is what the blood is signifying.
Pausing over what is taking effect with Aaron and his sons, however, sharpens what we can say is happening when blood is applied to them. From the priestly perspective of the world, everything can be mapped into two binaries: common, ordinary, or holy, pure, clean, or impure, unclean. Aaron and his sons are transitioning from one metaphysical realm to another. They are going from the realm of the common to the realm of the holy. The blood applied to Aaron and his sons is one integral part of this transition. It is part of what sanctifies or consecrates them. By this process of metaphysical transition, they are essentially becoming walking, sacred dwelling place furniture.
So it's like a rite of passage.
Yeah.
Really.
The sense of it is nothing is happening with the blood, but it's a ritual they're doing to signify the metaphysical transition.
They were also sprinkled with blood at the covenant inauguration, which all the people were. But this is showing that now they're also transitioning into this metaphysical realm of being the priests for all the people.
Right.
And then I mentioned the other time that blood is applied to people is when they have been healed from scale disease. Apparently, when someone was stricken with this scale disease, they were officially considered a corpse and they were cut off from having community with the rest of the people.
Yeah.
Once they have been healed from scale disease, they have this ritual of having blood applied to them, and that transitions them metaphysically from being a walking dead person to being a full-fledged member of society again.
Right.
Becoming an alive person. As Milgram expresses, the entire purification process is nothing but a ritual, a rite of passage, marking the transition from death to life. They go from the walking dead, outcasted from the whole community, to becoming reintegrated as full-fledged participants in his community and its worship. What has become clear from the foregoing, and what will be useful for analyzing certain New Testament texts later, is that when blood is applied to people, it always marks a transition from one metaphysical realm into another in the direction of greater holiness. Thus, for the soon-to-be priests, this is a transition from being a regular lay Israelite to a consecrated priest. For the person who has recovered from scale disease, this is a transition from the realm of death, from being the walking dead and thus excluded from the community and liturgical life, back to life as a full community member. Sacrificial blood used in this way indexes metaphysical transitions up the scale of holiness. None of this has anything to do with a ritual or symbolic substitutionary death. We have established the indexing function of the blood for all three of the sacrificial rituals that feature the distinctive action of applying the blood to both the people and the altar, namely that it indexes a bond between them. We also further established how this ritual indexes a metaphysical transition, but only for the instance of Aaron and his sons moving from the common as laity to the holy as priests, and for the person who has recovered from scale disease transitioning from death to life. All this provides a strong warrant to comprehend the covenant inauguration. All of this provides a strong warrant to comprehend the covenant inauguration as likewise being about a metaphysical transition for Israel as a whole. That is, the blood ritual is not only about forging a covenantal bond between Israel and God via the altar, but is also indexing their metaphysical transition from being a regular people to a treasured possession, Exodus 19, and a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. In none of these blood rituals would substitutionary death make any sense. The point here is that not all ritual blood is endowed with the same meaning and function. Therefore, attempting to reduce sacrificial blood to one thing, let alone substitutionary death, is fundamentally mistaken. It conflates where the priestly system distinguishes. It misunderstands that nuance and distinction is at the very heart of priestly discernment, which is why there are various types of sacrifices, non-sacrificial rituals, different blood manipulations, etc.
This is how Rillera concludes the chapter. It's a nice summary of his arguments because this was obviously pretty technical and detailed, and we were doing it in summary fashion. So, as demonstrated, sacrifices have distinct rationales and functions apart from atonement. The daily burnt offerings, for instance, serve the purpose of drawing divine attention. Well-being offerings facilitate sacred feasting between God and humanity, enacting and fostering the union of God and the community. Both the Passover and the covenant inauguration and renewal ceremonies only employ non-atoning sacrifices. And not only is the Passover a unique Thanksgiving well-being sacrifice, commemorating God's deliverance of Israel in the Exodus, the initial Paschal meal was not even a sacrifice, let alone some sort of atoning substitutionary death sacrifice. Furthermore, I argued, rituals of blood sprinkling on the people have nothing to do with atonement or substitutionary death. Whenever blood is applied to people, it ritually marks and facilitates specific metaphysical transitions unique to each cultic context.
He continues, now keeping the larger aim of understanding how the New Testament authors make use of Old Testament sacrificial imagery and to comprehend various meaning of Jesus' death, it needs to be appreciated that the only sacrificial interpretation of Jesus' death that claims to go back to Jesus is his words at his last Passover. Jesus tethers it both to the non-atoning communal celebrations of Passover and the covenant inauguration by quoting or alluding to Exodus 24:8, the blood of the covenant. You can find that in the Gospel of Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, also mentioned in 1 Corinthians 11. And King Hezekiah already set the precedent for bringing these two celebrations, Passover and covenant renewal, together in 2 Chronicles 29.
I address views that try to shoehorn atonement into the Lord's Supper accounts in chapter 5. But for now, the fact that both the Passover and the covenant inauguration sacrifice have nothing to do with atonement, and so are communal sacrificial meals, needs to be appreciated. The very act of eating these is a major hurdle for anyone who thinks atonement is part of the Lord's Supper. As we saw, feasting and fasting are diametrically opposed cultic activities. The former is associated with celebration and thanksgiving, whereas the latter is associated with sins and atonement. The fact that both Passover and covenant inauguration sacrifices are non-atoning celebrations is the point of departure. For further analyzing the sacrificial meaning, various New Testament authors inscribe either into the Lord's Supper more specifically or Jesus' death more broadly. Alas, there is still a while to go before delving into the New Testament.
We're not there yet.
Right.
Ending this chapter by throwing out there this argument that to understand Jesus' death as an atoning sacrifice is not faithful. You feel like you're ending on this moment of tension.
Right.
This unresolved feeling, to be continued feeling. Right. Okay, well, what is it then? Help me understand what you're trying to say here.
Right.
There's a bit of an unsettled feeling
as
we go through this.
Yeah, the other thing that stood out to me, because he's linking the Lord's Supper here to the Passover, and he's saying the Passover was, in essence, memorial.
Yeah.
It just made me think of New Testament views on communion. I've always held to a memorial view, but there are some people that think there's something going on in the elements as you're taking communion. It just made me think of that as we were reading this. Mm-hmm. I just wonder how that's going to play out.
It also reminds me that apparently in the apocryphal book, the Gospel of the Ebionites Gospel, apparently there's a line in there where Jesus says, I have no desire to eat the flesh of this Paschal lamb with you, the night of his Last Supper.
Right.
Kind of what you were talking about earlier, this idea that the God represented in this Old Testament compared to the God that is represented in the person of Jesus Christ feels like two different gods.
Right.
And the fact that Jesus comes in and cleanses the temple and releases all the sacrificial animals,
right,
and apparently really did not offer his own sacrifices, some would say,
right,
in his own life. And then the Ebionite gospel saying, I don't want to eat a Paschal lamb with you this Passover. You were saying to me earlier, Kevin, Jesus comes and is not about all of this ritual and all of these technical laws and, this sacrifice for this and do it this way for that. Jesus comes and is all about, hey, let's love. Let's love
right,
justice. Let's stand up for the oppressed.
Right. To that point, how many times have we heard God saying, I don't want your sacrifices. I just want your obedience. And then Christ comes along And even if he doesn't want you to, in essence, we know with the Pharisees, even obey the letter of the law, but obey the spirit of the law, right? And so at the end of the day, that's what God wants. He wants us to be loving, a loving community that is supporting each other. And it's just fascinating to me that you've got all this ritual going on. I mean, as I was reading this, the fact that there are non-atoning sacrifices where blood is involved. So we're killing an animal, we're using its blood, and there's not even a substitutionary or atoning thing going on. It's just part of a ritual. And again, that points back to ancient Near Eastern cults, ancient Near Eastern pagan rituals. And I'm just wondering why we're doing that. It doesn't seem like Jesus was doing that.
Yeah.
And so I was just thinking too, if the people are going to be in a covenant bond relationship with God, wouldn't it make more sense for them to use their own blood versus an animal's blood, right? Cut yourself and throw some of your blood on the altar and be in covenant with God. It's you or who are in covenant with God. Why are you bringing an animal into this to sacrifice? Anyway, there's just some observations. The more I read this chapter, the more I feel like, again, I've said it many times already, but there are these cultural artifacts of the ancient Near East that are playing into this.
Yeah. I remember at some point near the end of the chapter, I started being overwhelmed by this obsession with blood, this magical power of blood that the ancient people had. At some point, it starts to feel, I don't know, creepy.
Yeah.
Very pagan.
It does seem very pagan.
You might even, could I even say the word satanic at some point? This idea that we need to shed blood and we need to be covered with blood, and that's where the power is. That's where the protection is.
It seems unnecessary.
Clearly, he hasn't put a nice little bow on anything yet. He's just laying out information, right? But as I'm trying to look forward as to where he's going, I'm thinking, okay, so the Last Supper, Jesus can't be invoking the idea of an atoning sacrifice that's about to happen because there's eating involved, there's feasting involved. They're celebrating the Passover, which is thanking God for the deliverance. It has to be a well-being sacrifice, and it certainly seems like there's some covenant inauguration / covenant renewal going on,
Right.
which means that there's bonding happening and there's going to be a metaphysical transition going on with the people who follow Jesus.
Right. The metaphysical transition's going to happen without the ritual, I feel. I'm sure that'll come up again as we progress through this book. But all the things that Christ did, all the things that happened, I don't know that there were all these rituals involved.
Well, thanks for hanging in there this long, folks.
Appreciate it.
We love you and hope you have a great day.
Absolutely. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.